minutes before we go ahead.
So, Julien, where are you actually based at the moment?
I'm in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon University. I just started a new postdoc here in September.
Right.
Yeah.
And you already found your way around?
Yeah. It took a minute. I feel like right now it's been like maybe like 6, 7 months is the amount of time when you feel like okay, you know what you're kind of doing and you figured your way around. But yeah, it's an exciting place to be doing research.
Good. Good. Very much looking forward to hearing about your latest research.
I hope you like it.
I'm sure I will. I'm sure. Yeah, there's more people coming. Okay.
All right.
Here we go. I think we're good to go.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do it. So, all right. Today I have the pleasure of introducing my fellow neuroscientist and good friend, Julien Dirani. Julien is a postdoctoral fellow at the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University and a collaborator in the Cortical Systems Lab at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. He obtained his PhD at New York University, where he worked in the Neuroscience of Language Lab, supervised by Dr. Lina Pilkanen. Before that, he obtained a master's in cognitive neuroscience from University College London and a bachelor's in psychology with a minor in philosophy from the American University of Beirut. And in his current work, Julien uses a combination of neuroimaging, behavioral, and computational methods to investigate the neural basis of language. His work investigates how semantic knowledge and concepts are stored and accessed across various tasks and sensory modalities, what mechanisms support lexical selection, and how they interact with semantic knowledge. And so today, Julien will talk to us about the interplay between conceptual representations and lexical processing in language based on high temporal resolution MEG data. And with that, Julien, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so today I'll be talking to you about mainly what Ahmed just said about the how concepts are represented in the brain, how we store meaning in the brain, and how we also retrieve words based on this meaning. So let's start with a quick example. Ahmed, since you know I know your microphone works at least. If I ask you to name this picture, what would you say it is?
I would say dog.
Good job. And that's an easy and quick process. I would like to illustrate that very different types of informations or representations were active in this very short span of time that it took Ahmed to say the word dog. So to illustrate, first, a visual representation had to be recognized or activated from the picture that finally led to the word dog that Ahmed produced. During this process, there is also a rich amount of like different types of information that could have been activated. For example, some meaning might have been retrieved from the picture. For example, the fact that this is an animal, it has a tail, it can run, which we can call the semantic knowledge or loosely around what a dog means for Ahmad in this case. But in the neurobiology of language, there's also evidence that sensory motor features also play a role in sort of helping us encode like meaning in general. So from the short period of time that it took to recognize this picture and name it, I just want to illustrate here very loosely that very rich amount of information were activated in this quick process. Now we can flip this process around, and if you look at another modality like reading a word, the process might start in a different place. So you might have to retrieve a word for it that will then activate different types of meanings, right? So given different modalities, we can still arrive at some invariant meaning. Both of these modalities give us the same thing. We hope that at least dogness in multiple modality has some amount of stability. And what I'll try to investigate today is, first of all, how is it that conceptual representations connect with words? in this representation space. And what is the nature of modality-independent representations? So whether you're looking at the picture of a dog or you're reading the word dog, what is the subset of those representations that will be consistently active? What are the representations that will be invariant? And these are kind of the high-level questions that kind of guide my research. And the way I've been studying this is using these two modalities, as I said, and the reason I use picture naming and word reading specifically is that they are, first of all, matched in terms of that they both start with a visual representation. There's a stimulus that is, in the experiment, participants both start with like seeing a visual stimulus and have to end with a verbal response. However, there are some interesting distinctions between these two modalities, one of which is that, first of all, only in the pictures do you have to actually retrieve a word for production. So, do a lexical search, I guess. So you look at the picture and you have to retrieve the word dog. You have to find the correct word given some meaning that you have extracted. Whereas when you read a word, you could easily just, you could read non-words or pseudo words, right? You don't necessarily have to retrieve the right lexical item. You can just recognize the lexical item. Another interesting feature of these two modalities is that the picture of the dog, we talked about words, now let's talk about meaning a little bit. The picture of a dog kind of gives you a single exemplar of a dog. This is the dog I'm showing you to recognize. So maybe the meaning of the conceptual features you will retrieve from the stimulus will be a little bit maybe more restrained. I don't know. We'll see. Whereas when you read the word, the word dog kind of represent the class of dogs, like a category of things. It's not so much pointing you to a specific exemplar. And the way I study these two modalities in these studies that I will present today is using magnetoencephalography. I'm sure all of you are familiar with magnetoencephalography, but essentially it's a brain imaging tool that has a really high temporal resolution. And since naming a word, as Ahmed demonstrated, happens really fast, MEG is really useful because we're able, at every millisecond from the moment a stimulus is shown until response, we can look at how the brain activity unfold at this millisecond scale. And MEG also has a decent spatial resolution, so we can also ask on the cortical surface where activity was coming from. So that's sort of the setup in which I kind of did these studies that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to kind of narrow down the questions a little bit more, so they're a little bit more targeted than those high-level questions. So the first question I'm going to be talking about today is how are words selected during language production? How do we go from the representation of meaning to map it onto the correct word, right, during speech? Second, we're going to ask how conceptual and lexical representations unfold over time from the moment of the perception of a stimulus until response. I briefly showed now two arrows with very big words and depicting some temporal unfolding in my previous slide, but let's sort of empirically kind of like either validate that or break it down a little bit further. And finally, we'll get to what I think is like the more interesting questions, the juicy bit is at the end, which is about the timing of activation of modality-independent concepts and what is the nature of modality-independent concepts. Again, building up to this question of what is the subset of representations that will be shared across modalities. All right, and I should say, like, feel free to this doesn't have to be just me talking at the Zoom. Feel free to interrupt with clarification questions or some small discussion questions. And of course, there'll be time for questions at the end. But let's start with the first question. How are words selected during language production? Oops, sorry about that. I'm going to start with illustrating a very known effect, which is semantic priming. If you're reading the word dog out loud and it's preceded by a semantically related prime, like cat, it will be much faster to read the word compared to when it's preceded by an unrelated prime. And this kind of evidence has been used to support this idea of spreading activation, where if you activate the word cat, the activation will spread to related nodes in the brain, which will facilitate your recognition and naming of the word dog. Now, another interesting finding, which is quite old at this point, but at some point was surprising to many, is that if you do the same experiment, but instead of having a word, you have a picture, now you have the actually opposite effect. in most cases anyway, where a related semantic related prime will actually slow you down if you're trying to name the picture of the dog, right? And this sort of has kind of created this sort of uncertainty or like debate in the field, which on one hand, this could indicate that during language production, when we're searching for the right word, because as a reminder, when you read the word, you're recognizing the word, but when you're naming a picture, you have to do some kind of lexical selection step. So that this lexical selection step involves competition between related words, so that when you're searching for the word dog, the word cat is actually interfering with it, right? There's a cost of activating cat and dog at the same time, slower reaction times, right? But the opposite, sort of on the other hand, there's like other suggestions that there's actually no competitions for selection, that there is actually a facilitation similarly in the pictures and in the word, but that the slowdown, the slower reaction times is due to the task itself, that you have to sort of determine which is the right word that you have to say given two words are active. So what we're going to try to do with MEG using the high temporal resolution of MEG is we're going to set up this priming study. And then we're going to look at over time, what kinds of, where could we identify over time these priming effects and hopefully try to separate out these two possible hypotheses. So to talk real quick about my design, I mean, it should be pretty obvious from the setup, but we're going to have our two modalities, which will be word reading and object naming or picture naming. People will be naming things out loud, and we'll have three prime types. There will be the semantically related prime, unrelated prime, and we have also an identical priming effect, condition, just so that we can sort of sandwich our semantically related condition between like the most amount of priming you can get, which is table, and hopefully the baseline condition of like unrelated to the target word. So we're going to look at straight into the results of the MEG data. First, we're going to look at the words. So here we're looking at activation over time. And each line will represent, average responses for our three conditions here. So what we see here is that if we look at the unrelated priming condition, which is the one in green, we see that both the identical priming, so dog, and the semantic priming, which is something like cat, dog, show a decrease in activation, and these go in the same direction. So here's it's important to kind of consider that the identical condition will be sort of our guideline as to which direction the facilitation effect is. So identity priming will give us the strongest facilitation effect, and then we can compare our semantically related priming condition to it. Now, interesting in the pictures, we also see not exactly the same pattern, but a similar pattern in which, again, the priming effect is in the same direction for semantic related priming and identical priming. This sort of points to an early facilitation effect in both conditions, kind of pointing that both in the pictures and in the words, it seems to be that there is this sort of spreading activation between related words when they're co-activated. Now, the interesting thing comes when we look at a later time point in the pictures, we find that actually there is actually a very different pattern in which if we look at the identically related prime, again, that shows us the direction of facilitation. Semantic relatedness goes in the opposite direction, right? So this can be interpreted as a late interference effect that comes after this early facilitation that we observed in the pictures. So to sort of quickly wrap up this first study that was kind of the beginning of my interest in like this kind of neuroscience of language space, we found evidence that there was spreading activation between related words in both pictures and in words, and that words don't necessarily compete for selection, because even in pictures we saw that there was an early facilitation effect, and that the interference effect came out later, most likely after lexical selection stages occurred. So this was, as I said, like a first step looking at more like classical psycholinguistics methods to look at word retrieval. And then later on, I kind of started becoming more interested in conceptual representations and meaning and how these interact with lexical representations. So moving on to our next question, we're going to ask how conceptual and lexical representations unfold over time from the moment that the stimulus is perceived until response. So as a reminder, we have MEG data. This was done at NYU in New York, and the MEG has 157 sensors. And the question we'll be asking is, at every single time point in this MEG data, we're going to ask what kind of representations are active? Could it be lexical information or conceptual information? And we're going to be comparing not only at every single time point the content of the information, but we can ask questions such as, if we find some, let's say conceptual information at this point, would it be rapidly changing over time, or would it be sustained, maybe reactivated later? I'll explain this in detail on the next slide. And we'll be doing this for the words too. So let me talk about my design real quick, and then I'll sort of specify a bit the methods. But essentially for this study, we're going to be doing, we're still going to hold on to our words and our pictures. This time there will be no priming setup. So essentially people see either a picture or a word, and they still have to name it out loud. Importantly here, I will say that we split our data into animals and tools. So the conceptual representation we'll be looking at in terms of this first study will be at a high-level semantic category. So how are superordinate semantic categories of animacy represented in both those modalities? So the method we'll be using is decoding with generalization across time. I think it's a pretty popular method. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. I will explain it here, just in case somebody isn't fully familiar with it. But as I said, we have an MEG machine with 157 sensors. But here, just for the purpose of illustrating, let's assume we only have 2 sensors and that we only have 3 time points. Right, so at each of our time points, we're going to have some pattern of activity for each of our exemplars here for the pictures, and we can fit, and this happens at every single time point, and we can fit a linear classifier here to separate our semantic categories, animals and tools, and we can do this at every single time point. And every single time point will give us a score of how well this classifier performed. So this can give us like a metric of how strongly is semantic category captured in the brain data at every one of these time points. Again, here I'm just showing a 2-dimensional plot, assuming 2 sensors. This is actually done in high-dimensional space, and there's many more time points than 3 time points. Now, what we can do again to ask whether this representation at time t1 is the same or similar to representation at time 2 and 3, etc. What we can do, first of all, bear with me as I put these scores in this matrix, which will make sense hopefully in a sec, is for every model trained at every time point, we can test its ability to generalize at every other time point, which can give us a score of how well those representations at each time point generalize to all other time points. And then the results essentially look like this matrix here. The way to read this essentially is anything on the diagonal, if these represents this these classification scores at corresponding time points, right? Time t1, t2, t3. And everything off the diagonals tells us about the generalization of a representation across time, right? So for example, this is of course fake data here, but like at time t1, a classifier trained at time t1 and had a score of 0.9 here would have generalized not very well at time t2, as slightly better at time t3, right? So you look at this in terms of like, for example, rows. And it's important like to take a minute to like get familiar with this, because most of my results from now on are going to look like matrices, which will kind of look like weather maps, but I promise are actually brain data. Any questions on this?
Julien, I will ask a question here about in this fake example, you're showing that, for example, for T2, on the
Yeah.
diagonal itself, T2 doesn't generalize well. Is this across trials? So
Uh,
would you average the matrix across trials, and then you basically the matrix we will see will be like an average for every single trial with on average if you were to generalize two different trials within the same time bin?
the training and testing is done across trials, and what ends
Okay.
up being is each subject ends up having one matrix
Okay.
of results, and the group level result will be group level statistics on these matrices per subject,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So you look at
So yeah.
So yeah,
No,
the
go on,
final
go on.
result will be like, I mean, this of course is fake data here, which doesn't make too much
Yeah.
sense. But like, you know, the 0.7 would be the average accuracy score across subjects when you train
Okay.
at time, you know, sorry, T1 and tested at time T3, for example. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, key thing is to look at like diagonal would be like those corresponding time points. Anything off diagonal means something at some point got like displaced over time or like sustained over time. Thanks for the question. Okay, assuming this is clear, let's jump right into our results. As a reminder, we're sort of looking at conceptual representations at this point, and the granularity we're at is animacy. So we're going to look at animals and tools and how these are separated in the MEG data for pictures and for words, right? So let's start right with the pictures. This is the result for our picture. Again, of course, this is more fine grained. We have, you know, many more time points than 3 here. And let's take a second to look at our results. So first of all, let's the line here that I'm drawing these clusters are Ahmed, this is related to what you asked, but are the kind of group level statistics. So we're drawing a cluster around the accuracy scores that are above chance when we perform our group level statistics. And the hard solid line is the threshold is p.01, and the dashed line is less than 0.05 essentially. So what we see here is that there is a blob, there is a cluster, which essentially means we were able to separate animals and tools in the pictures. And we see that the onset is at around 75 milliseconds. Sorry, again, on top of the plot, I'm just plotting the diagonal, which is sort of like here plotted as a heat map, just for easier visualization. So the onset of decoding is at around 75 milliseconds. So 75 milliseconds after you see the picture in the brain data, we're able to classify whether it was an animal or a tool. And it's sustained throughout most of the timeline all the way until um, um, response. Now there was these sort of like uh, tube-shaped generalizations here of the diagonal, which are maybe like interesting to think about, which is at around, again, the way to read this is at around 150 milliseconds, we trained a model that when we tested it at 400 milliseconds, 500, 600 milliseconds, it also generalized. So what does this tell us? This tells us that there is some representations about animacy that was active early on at 150 milliseconds that was either sustained or reactivated later on. There's a piece of information early on that remains maybe important enough to be like reactivated at a later time point. Now we're sort of this is kind of like a classical, not a classical, but like this has been replicated many times. This sort of pattern of decoding with pictures, and this is sort of the pattern that is expected. But let's maybe look at how it compares to that of the words. So first of all, again, we do see that we are able to um, decode animacy from the words, which I think was like back then I found that slightly happily surprising, I would say, because you can read the word and not necessarily retrieve whether it's an animal or a tool, right? Like this is not taken for granted, right? But nevertheless, while reading the word dog, we were able to decode the semantic category with an onset at around 100 milliseconds. And unlike the decoding pattern for the pictures, we don't see, I mean, there is some, off-diagonal generalization, but we don't see this sort of like tube-shaped generalization where some information is like held on over time, right? It seems that to some extent, every single step of the process is some kind of a change representation. Every single model, again, with of course some buffer around the diagonal, model trained at specific time points are changing over time, basically. There is very minimal generalization. Okay. Any questions on how to read these? All right. So now the question is, we have looked at this sort of course level semantic representation and how it develops over time with pictures and for words. But if you remember my introduction, but the question is like, how does this relate with lexical processes? So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of blur out the background. This is the same data, but we're taking out the heat map, and we're going to repeat the same exercise of decoding that we did with semantic category, but we're going to do the same with the lexical frequency, and we're going to do the same with a measure of visual complexity. And I will say these measures are continuous. However, they've been median split here to have a binary classifier so that our results are kind of more fairly compared to those of the semantic category classification. So let's start with lexical frequency in green here. So I'll point you a little bit, I'll point your eye to the diagonal results here. Let's see at which time, at which onset time are lexical representations here active. And in the pictures, what we see is that they are active after those of semantic category. So the way I look at this is the first step is that the first visible result was the decoding of semantic category that was followed by lexical frequency here, which is kind of intuitive based on this like draft time course I've plotted in the introduction. Is like when you look at the picture, you first have to recognize some meaning, and you then have to map this meaning onto a word, right? The word isn't given to you, basically. Interestingly, in the words, you actually see kind of the reverse here, right? So we do see that first lexical frequency is activated, and following that, we see that semantic category is then activated, which again follows this intuition that in the words, you have this kind of like opposite direction in which you recognize the word and then you map that onto some meaning. Okay. Now this is this is a nice result to get as a sanity check because that's what we expect. And it would be all nice and good until I'm going to throw in some complications here when we look at visual information. Okay. So what do we see with visual information for the pictures? It is kind of suspicious, don't you think, that visual representations are active pretty much simultaneously as category information in the pictures, right? So what might this tell us? It might tell us that maybe I'm not decoding semantic category here. Maybe I'm decoding some kind of like visual information that is consistently different across my classes here. Just something to think about. And now for the words also, we do, double down on the complications here, but we do also see that our measure of visual representations coincide in time with our representations of lexical frequency. And as a quick quiz, why might that be the case? Think of English words. So this is a study in English. I maybe should have said. I think it was obvious. But essentially, in English, longer words are generally less frequent, right? And longer word would be visually more complex on screen, right? So here we do also have, a potential confound that our measure of lexical frequency was, although we tried to maximally have them not correlated, but this might be a case in which we're not sure exactly whether we're decoding visual complexity or lexical frequency. I'll leave this puzzle for the next section. So I'll just pause here for a second in case anybody has a question or we want to discuss a bit further. All right, so let's sort of summarize the takeaway from part 2, and hopefully in part 3 we'll kind of like unpack these puzzles a little bit more. So we asked, how do conceptual and lexical representation unfold over time? And we compared pictures and words. And in pictures, we found that visual representations and semantic category were activated first, followed by lexical representations. Whereas in words, we found that visual representations and lexical representations were activated first, followed by semantic category, which sort of supported this intuition that I started with at the beginning. Now, throughout the talk, I'm just going to add some simplified timelines here on the right, just to keep us reminded of sort of onset times that we found, but for semantic category in the pictures, we found an onset time at 75 milliseconds, and for the words, it was slightly later at 100 milliseconds. All right, so the third question is about the timing of activation of modality-independent concept. At which time point is it going to be that some representation of meaning that is shared across these two modalities is going to be active? And this is going to be related to those puzzles I kind of brought up in the end of the last section. So just to quickly summarize, we had, a picture naming condition and MEG data over time. And at some point in this timeline, we found that we were able to decode semantic category, let's say at time t1, right? But again, I raised this problem of we are not sure exactly what we're decoding here, because if you look at a subset of the stimuli here, like we're decoding semantic category, but in reality, we could be decoding like something about visual complexity, right? We could be decoding things that are pointy versus things that are a little bit more blobby. We could be things that have faces, right? The first row, all of these things have faces, and none of the tools have faces. So maybe you can tell me, Julien, maybe you're just decoding faces here. I mean, you're not decoding semantic category at all. So how are we going to solve this problem? Well, one piece of good news is that we have a second condition in which this visual representation and conceptual representation are not so confounded. But we can also do something else, which is if we have a model that is trained to decode semantic category on the pictures, and we test this model on the words and it generalizes there, it must have relied on something that is independent of the input modality. It must have relied on something that isn't the low-level features of the stimulus, right? I repeat the logic because it's going to be important for later, but essentially, again, if we train a model on the pictures and it decodes semantic category, and we test it on unseen data from the words and it also decodes semantic category, then the model must have learned something about semantic category that is independent of the visual features of the pictures themselves, right? So using this method, we're going to try to find which time point at which these models are able to generalize across conditions, which will tell us the time point at which these modality-independent representations will be active. Okay, is that clear? Awesome.
Yes.
Unfortunately, it gets a little bit more complicated because if we only train and test at corresponding time point, we might miss some representations that are displaced in one condition compared to the other, right? So again, the results will live in this matrix that will again look like a weather map. So let me sort of break it down real quick here before we proceed. If we train a model at corresponding time point, if we train a model at, let's say, time t1 in the pictures and test it at time t1 in the words, and it generalizes, the blob will essentially be located on the diagonal, which will indicate simultaneity, which means that these representations are active at simultaneous times in the pictures and the words, right? Now, if we train a model at later time points in the pictures and those generalize at earlier time point in the words, we will see that the results will be above the diagonal, indicating some delay in the representations in the pictures compared to the words. And of course, vice versa. We could train models early on in the pictures that don't generalize early on in the words, but do generalize later on in the words. And then the blob will be displaced under the diagonal. Right? So what to look for is diagonal means simultaneity, and off the diagonal would mean some displacement in time for one condition compared to the other condition. Again, we're going to look at some of these plots, so I'm just going to pause here in case it's unclear. We're good? Okay, great. I'll throw back the reminder here of time points of onset time. So we had seen that within modality, decoding onset for the picture was at 75 milliseconds, and within modality for the word, the onset was at 100 milliseconds. And again, as a reminder, we're looking at semantic categories, so animals versus tools. So let's look at that result. So again, the blob here, the line will indicate essentially our significant result at the group level. And the first thing to look at is there a blob? Are there representations that are invariant of stimulus modality? And the presence of the blob tells us that there are some time points. I hope that is intuitive. There are some time points at which, independent of the stimulus, the representation of animacy will be similar or shared. Now that we've established that, let's sort of break down the timing of activation of those representations. So again, remember the diagonal versus off-diagonal thing we have to pay attention to. So let's first look at the first part is on the diagonal, and the onset is at around 150 milliseconds. So it's simultaneous. It falls on the diagonal. It means it's simultaneous. 150 millisecond here, 150 millisecond here. For both the pictures and the words, semantic information that is an abstracted away from the stimulus, so in modality-independent representations, are active for both the pictures and the words at around 150 milliseconds, and they stay on the diagonal. There's early simultaneity on the diagonal until around 400 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds. When we get to around that time, we do see some displacement of the diagonal, which means that there are some representations in the pictures that are delayed compared to the words. I'm illustrating this here on this kind of one-dimensional plot, which is a simplification, but I do think it helps kind of to think about the results here. But there are some representations that are simultaneously active for the pictures and the words. Onset is 150 milliseconds. But there's some representations in the pictures that are shared with the words, but they are displaced in time, right? There is later in the picture compared to the words. Now, why might that be? So my best guess, if you look at the behavior results, these are reaction times for every one of the for every condition here. In general, you will be slower to name pictures than to read words, right? This is a consistent result. And so it might be that in general, the timeline to name a picture is slightly more stretched over time compared to the words, which will end up causing this delay. The kind of clear-cut sort of finding here is, again, intuitively, modality-specific representations are active first, and then modality-independent representations are activated later. What is interesting is that they are activated simultaneously for pictures and the words. Now, my work for this study didn't really look so much at localization, like where are these representations coming from in the brain. We can still project our classifier weights on the topographical map of the MEG. And the way to read this, again, in case this is new, this is essentially the picture of a head. We're looking at the head from the top. The triangle is the nose. These are the two ears. And essentially, we're plotting our classifier weight. Remember, we trained classifiers on MEG data. For every sensor, there's a weight that was learned. And in orange, I'm sort of highlighting the time points at which the classifier generalized. So these are the classifier that were trained on the pictures and generalized to the words. I wouldn't read too much into this, honestly. We shouldn't really interpret classifier weights as evidence of localization from the brain activity. But there is some interesting, at least interesting pattern is like at around 100 millisecond, we see these kind of like occipitally localized weights where the classifier doesn't generalize. And then after this time point, the classifier starts generalizing. So there's this kind of intuition that like early visual, of course, was very like picture specific. And then at around 150 milliseconds, representations became somewhat more abstracted, to use the forbidden word, and generalized to the words. So what we have found so far is the timing of activation of modality-independent concept, but we only looked at a binary separation of concept. We only looked at animals and tools, right? Now, I think everybody would argue that the brain can recognize things beyond this granularity, a little bit more fine-grained. So the next question is, can we replicate this effect? Can we do the same kind of approach using what I'm going to call basic level concepts? So can we look at modality-independent representations of concept at single exemplar level, right? A dog versus a rabbit versus a hammer versus a spoon. Okay, so we're gonna do pretty much the same thing, except we're gonna try to look at these basic level concepts. I do have to say the experimental design here will have to change. So if you remember in the first study, the task was to name the picture out loud. And if we do that here and then we classify each picture, then the result might be to confound your, motor, even motor noise in the MEG with the actual response. So we have to have some kind of task that is orthogonal to what we're going to be essentially classifying. We're going to be classifying these stimuli, so the task has to be somewhat unrelated. And so it will be a binary judgment using button presses. That's the only difference here. It was 25 subject, native English speakers. Again, it's going to be using MEG data. So again, as I said, we're going to look at similarly shaped matrix as before, except that now we're going to be, instead of decoding superordinate semantic information, animals and tools, we're going to be looking at what I'm calling basic level information, which is going to be like individual exemplars, essentially. And here's our result. So I mean, first thing to look at is it is much noisier than the previous result. With MEG data, it was kind of a challenge. It is a risk to take in your last year of PhD to try to do a 16-way classification from MEG data and hope to find something. So I was happy to find that there was something. Here again, we trained on the words we tested on the pictures at individual exemplar levels here. So there was 16 exemplars, so chances by 0.065. So what we do see, first of all, is there is evidence for generalization across conditions. So when we trained on the words and tested on the pictures, we did see that there are invariant modality independent or invariant representations of basic level concepts when we compared words and pictures, and the onset here was later than what we had found before, at around 250 milliseconds. So I'm gonna again summarize quickly what we found here, and then we're going to come back and break down this matrix a little further. So we had asked about the timing of activation of modality-independent concepts. When is it that shared representation are active across these two conditions? And we use cross-condition decoding to find these timings of activation. We found that superordinate representations were active at around 150 milliseconds. And basic level representations are active at around 250 milliseconds in both the pictures and the words. So the sort of pattern that emerges across these two studies is that there is almost like a reverse hierarchical, depending on how you think about it, stages in which the first level of abstraction is a high-level superordinate, and the second later stage of abstraction is at a lower level, basic level representation. So you first, the first bit of information that is independent of stimulus modality is a superordinate, and then followed by basic level. So animal and then dog, basically. So this brings us to our last question, and maybe, for me at least, the most interesting one, which is about the nature of modality-independent conceptual representations. So what I've sort of illustrated so far is there are representations that are shared across modalities, but we haven't really sort of looked at what are the content of those representations, right? Or is this just like a semantic representation that is shared across these two conditions, or is it something else? So let's sort of break down these potential hypotheses here. So what is the nature of modality-independent representations? The first hypothesis that I try to illustrate is one of semantic features, right? So whether you're looking at a picture or you're looking at a word, there might be this kind of shared semantic space in your brain that you access independently of modality to represent the meaning of a dog. And I think to me, this is like, the most intuitive hypothesis. But an alternative hypothesis is that sensory features might also sort of play a role here. So whether we're talking about visual features or auditory features, when you're looking, say, at the word dog, you might be activating some visual information about dogs. And you might also do the same when you're looking at the picture. So this is another hypothesis of what could be modality-independent representation here. And finally, a fourth hypothesis, or third hypothesis here, is about lexical features. So, it is a possibility that when you're reading the word dog, you're going to retrieve some lexical information about this word. But it is also possible that when you look at the picture of a dog, you might activate, to some extent, lexical features about the word dog itself. And this might be what our classifier had found in the previous section. All right, so we're going to be essentially like, investigating these hypotheses and see which ones support the data that I had found in this matrix. But let's sort of take a second to operationalize them. So we're going to start with the semantic features. So the way we operationalize the semantic features of each of our concepts or exemplars, this is prior work, this is not data that we've collected, is each concept was essentially normed by some hundreds of humans, I don't remember the exact number, to essentially determine what are the features that constitute each one of those concepts, right? It's a sparse matrix. So if you do a PCA and we do a pairwise distance for each of our exemplars, we end up with this kind of pairwise similarity matrix across our exemplars, showing so the geometry of the space under the assumption that the exemplars are organized by semantic features. Okay, and let's sort of look at this for a second. I think there are some interesting patterns that emerge just from this is not brain data. Again, this is just from these like behavioral norms. But we do see that all the animals sort of cluster together and all the tools cluster together. The cat and the dog are really similar, the cow and the goat. I don't know if these are farm animals, but they do have sort of more similarity. The knife and the fork are also really close. So this sort of captures some aspect of semantic information that seems intuitive, to me at least. So for sensory features, we actually again borrowed from prior work from Bindel et al. 2016, who have developed these brain-based experiential norms. Again, and we did this for the visual feature and auditory features. These aren't low-level sensory features. If I remember the specifics, these are sort of participants have to rate how visually similar two concepts are. Like you're given the word dog and the word cat, and then you have to sort of rate how visually similar these things are. So these aren't low-level visual stimulus of the stimuli. These are more like high-level human normed features, essentially, for visual and auditory features. And finally, for the lexical features, we build this, again, pairwise matrix of similarity for using Levenshtein's orthographic distance, which essentially give us these 4 matrices, which will essentially operationalize our hypotheses. So again, I repeat in case this was too fast, but we had these 4 hypotheses as to the content of modality-independent representations, and using these matrices, we kind of capture the shape of the exemplar's organization space under each one of those hypotheses. Okay. Now we're going to have to compare these somehow to those representations that we found using our cross-modal classification. So let's go back to that real quick. What we had found in this matrix is we had found pairs of time points in which we had trained the classifier on the words, and this classifier, when tested on the pictures, generalized well. Which means we had found classifiers that independently of whether they're taking in brain data from the pictures or from the words, they're able to classify the right label, right? So they must have, again, following the logic that I've illustrated before, these classifiers must have learned to extract some information from the brain data that is modality independent. So if we break open sort of the black box of those classifiers, this is a classifier that actually learned a compressed representation of the MEG space that before then, decoding the right exemplar. So if again we follow the logic that these classifiers are able to learn some representation that is modality independent, we're going to try to essentially open the black box of these classifiers and ask what kind of information was captured by those classifiers that are modality independent. Again, this is derived from the brain data, but it's a compressed version at this point. So what we're going to do is for each time point where the classifier is generalized, we're going to extract those modality-independent representations derived from the brain data. And we're going to build, again, our exemplar by exemplar, what I call neural dissimilarity matrix. This matrix now captures the shape of the space of those modality-independent concepts based on the brain data. And we're going to compare this space now to our 4 hypotheses, right, using a correlation. And essentially, this will allow us to sort of query whether one or multiple of these hypotheses will be essentially correlating with these modality-independent concepts at the brain level. All right, again, this gets a little bit more complicated because we have multiple models that generalize at multiple time points. So we're going to essentially do this RSA-style approach at each one of those time points. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to color code the result here based on which hypothesis correlated at this specific time point. Okay. All right, so let's start with the semantic features hypothesis. So we see an overwhelming greenness across the cluster, which means that at most of those time points where the classifier generalized, whatever this classifier learns seem to correlate with a model of semantic features based on those semantic features norms that were done using human behavior. So there seems to be, again, this widespread correlation with semantic features. Again, sort of supporting this intuition I had at the beginning, which is that there must be some shared semantic space in which, whether you're looking at the picture of a dog or the word dog, you recognize the same thing. Like dogness is somewhat the same, somehow the same in that shared semantic space. It has a tail, it's an animal, it barks, etc. So that's kind of the most expected positive result. But we do also see some correlation of those visual features, right? Those high-level visual features with those modality-independent features. They do seem to be somewhat more constrained to the diagonal, but with some off-diagonal presence too. Which essentially means that whether you're looking at the picture of the dog or a word dog, some visual processes or some visual information seem to be active independently of those two modalities, which wasn't the case for auditory features or lexical features. Again, so there was no effect of no correlation with lexical features or auditory features with our brain-based modality-independent representations. So let's just quickly summarize this, and I will talk about it a little more. So essentially, we asked about the nature of modality-independent representations, and we found that those brain-derived modality-independent representations correlated both with a semantic features-based hypothesis and a visual features hypothesis, which sort of underlines this idea that perceptual processes play a fundamental role in capturing those modality-independent concepts. We found no evidence that lexical representations or auditory features are automatically activated. It wasn't the case that when you look at the pictures, you automatically sort of retrieve the word dog, for example. Now, I would say this is a positive effect given our stimulus modalities, right? So suppose we add a third to get into the sort of like future work or limitations. But suppose we add a third modality that is auditory words or what we call auditory concepts. Maybe you just hear a barking sound. It might be that in those situations, we'll find that those modality-independent concepts will encompass some auditory features. But the key takeaway here is that those modality-independent concepts here had some perceptual component. So that's all I have to present in terms of my findings for today. So we started by showing sort of early work in the scale of my career of how words are selected during language production. Following that, we looked at the temporal evolution of lexical, visual, and conceptual features in the pictures and the word. Then looking at the timing of activation of modality-independent concept, which followed this reverse hierarchical pattern. And finally, looking at the content of those stimulus invariant conceptual representations that seem to correlate with models of semantic features and visual features. A quick hint at what might be coming next. Now that I just started recently this year a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon University and University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. So there's of course this question of anatomical and functional localization. I haven't shown any sort of brain localizations to these effects, but we're working on some exciting new findings using SEEG, also using some functional connectivity to try to get at those. And a second aspect, which I am getting personally more interested in, is this idea also that representations are static to some extent, but they're not purely static. So these invariant representations, there is evidence that they are modulated by task demands. And so what we're running now is this fMRI experiment looking at how the representation of an object might change over time or be modulated depending on the action that is executed on this object. So also basically bridging language and action here. No results here yet. Just happy to discuss these ideas if anybody's interested. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you for inviting me to speak here, and I'd like to thank my collaborators and our funding sources, the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, NYU Abu Dhabi's Research Institute, and the William Orr Dingwall Foundation. So thank you. I'll take questions or discussion points, and that will be all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Julien. I think this was a great and dense presentation with a lot to unpack. We have some time for a few questions, so if anyone has anything to ask now would be a good time. You can feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute and go ahead and ask.
Yeah, I can't see the chat for some reason, so yeah.
I see Steph has her hand up.
Yep.
Thanks, Julia. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering if you have any idea at which point along the developmental timeline we have those categories established.
Great question, actually. By category you mean those the modality independent at the modality independent level, or it's a great question, actually. I think it's more an empirical question. I'm not sure. All of our subjects were 18 years or above, so like from the data it's hard to tell, but again, it's an empirical question. It would be really interesting to look into that. Do you have any intuitions on that?
Not yet, but I'm also not a developmental language scientist. But we know that certain features in our language develop at a certain age, right? So semantic knowledge develops over time, humor at around the age of 12, for example. So I was just wondering if you would expect to see a similar developmental trajectory, or if that data may actually be available to have a look.
No, it's a great point. Yeah. Thank you. We've got another
Lilith.
raised
Yeah.
hand.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really a lot of information, also interesting methods that, yeah, I haven't encountered yet. Could you please, and I have a question about the method, so could you please go to I think it was the second question when you were looking at the time, when you first introduced the method, basically,
Yes.
the one that you generalize across time,
Uh-huh.
the linear classifier.
This one?
Yeah, but like already the actual results.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, here. So I'm just trying to understand. So there is a time point, right? And the signal is time correlated. So like at different time points, you have like um, these autocorrelation things.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say that certain process starts at 150 millisecond, are we sure that it is exactly at that time it starts, or is just, signal prepares and there is a peak, and that's the time where you perfectly can differentiate between two categories, or
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, one thing I'll say is that with this method, each time point is considered to be independent, which is not the case,
Yeah.
right? So here, each classifier is trained at a time point, tested at all the time point, and we assume independence of time point, which, yeah, again, is you know, I guess a shortcoming of this method. Um, if you want to do anything that takes into account dependence across time points, like usually you end up needing a lot more data and it gets noisier. So like here you just take the hit that you assume, make that assumption and
Mm-hmm.
interpret the results. But some, what you could do in terms of like this kind of preparatory representations is you could look at peak of activation. Peak
Yeah.
is not onset time, right? So what I'm looking at is like the earliest time point at which a representation is active.
Correct.
Um, and that's one metric to use, but you could totally use peak
Mm-hmm.
decoding time, right? So I guess depending on yeah, here we're looking at peak in terms of accuracy at peak, right? So i-
Mm-hmm.
if you're interested in the, yeah, if in having a, let's say, a classifier model that maximally predicts the class given a time point, you probably go with peak accuracy. But it really depends on what you want to interpret from the results. But you could definitely make this distinction of like onset and peak, basically.
Mm. And so were you thinking also for future try to use another algorithms of prediction like time series related, or uh, you would rather stick still in this type of method where it considers independence? Because maybe we can lose some
Yeah.
actually valuable information that can predict better the next uh, time
So
point. What do you
yeah,
think?
honestly, it's really going to depend on the data that you or I and one will work with. But like one way is to essentially, instead of taking individual time points, you can take sliding windows, and essentially now at
Yeah, yeah.
each
Mm-hmm.
classifier takes in like a window as opposed to a time point. Actually, one thing I should say is like you could also down here the data is actually downsampled by 10 milliseconds if I remember correctly. So you could also average
Okay.
a bunch of time points,
Mm,
which I should have mentioned here is done. Um, and you could go brute force some kind of recurrent neural network that has some kind of memory of past times, right? Um, but this is where I think your sort of the amount of data you'd need to get a result would just like
mm,
increase,
yeah.
and the complexity in terms of interpretation decreases also. So the neat aspect of this method is that each time point you have a classifier with weights that correspond to the shape of your data also. That was a linear transformation. It's just like usually linear, like more simple models will be more easily interpretable. It doesn't mean other models are not interpretable. But just it's a pros and cons things, right? There isn't like one best way to do this. Depending on what you want to focus on, you might go for one method or another. I thought here this method was
Yeah, this is really also interesting method. Another question is, you mentioned by the end of your presentation the functional connectivity. What exactly, could you talk more about this part? Like, are you trying to use the same method for functional connectivity, or
yes. So what we're currently working on is sort of still within that framework of modality independent, like task independent processes and task specific processes. Like the way it's framed here is going to be a little different. I mean, these are SEG implanted patients that are, here for clinical purposes for epilepsy. So these implantations are used to map out language processes prior to surgery to avoid kind of like removing an area that is uh, essential for language. And the idea here is like, if you do that based on only one task, then you'd only be mapping, you might be like overfitting the network, the language network to that task. And so when you're operating, you might be essentially like just looking at like the network for one specific task. So the project here is more kind of to map a global network of task-specific language network and also task general language network to maybe inform this surgical process a little better. And the basic science question that comes stacked on top of this is like the representation content of each of those networks, right? So that's kind of the framework we're looking at here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thank you also for this
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
dynamic representation, and yeah, it's really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time maybe for one last question, and then we should probably wrap up. So yes, I think we have one hand up. So go ahead, Liddy.
Yeah, thank you. Really nice presentation and the visuals as well. I just had one comment because I'm Chinese native speakers, and I just wonder how the different orthography, like different, like words, system would also affect on this, because like for example in Chinese character we all learned that growing up, we all learned that, okay, so the word or the character for human resemble human being. So it's like, I just wonder maybe Chinese character would retrieve semantic quickly than like English orthography, because it's more abstract than Chinese orthography. So yeah, just a comment, and then have you just like think about it, or maybe it would be interesting to explore as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I will say all of the stuff I've done is on more orthographically transparent languages. I've done English and Arabic only, and I mean Arabic is the most transparent, I think, more than English in terms of mapping, I guess, from letters to sounds. But I mean, what is your intuition? Would you think that like Chinese characters would be more like pictures? Is that what you're sort of pointing at? Or so maybe there would be less of a kind of divide between the pictures and the words because they're a little bit more similar. Is that what you're implying here?
Yeah, that's my intuition to that. Because like, yeah, maybe, but then also because also 80 to 90% of Chinese characters are not that strictly to visual cues. So it's more also kind of similar to English. It's like they also have phonetic cues in characters. So I feel like maybe different, maybe like, yeah, different lexical frequency, more complex word was more similar to like English words, but then low lexical frequency, high lexical frequency words would be more similar to visual representation.
I see. I mean, that would be really interesting because then within language, you could do a split of these two, right? You could look at the frequent and non-frequent words and see how those would come out. But yeah, no, honestly, yeah, these are all really interesting questions. Are you working on anything like that? Is there? No. Okay.
No, but yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're gonna have to end it here. We're gonna say thanks, Julien, for this great presentation again. And before we log off, just a reminder that the next CN Seminars talk will be on May 28th. It'll be Nel Demeyer on Can Routine Clinical Imaging Data Help Unravel Post-Stroke Cognition? And so I guess we'll see you at the next talk. And if you have any questions, you can email Julien. Hope you caught his email on the last slide. And yeah, see you all soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
See you.
everyone.